Hey, what's up, Element? I'm so glad that you guys have joined us today for week 2 of our series, Rebuild. We're taking a look at the book of Nehemiah and discovering what God has to say to each and every one of us about how to rebuild our spiritual lives. This week, we're standing here in the middle of Atlanta, as you guys can see all around me, this beautiful city. And this large city is home to millions of people who live and work and go about their day-to-day lives. And as we look at the book of Nehemiah had this incredible vision to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And he wanted Jerusalem to be a city much like what we see here in Atlanta, where the people of God could rebuild it in a way that was greater than the previous city that was destroyed that they lived in. And the people could once again go about their lives working and raising their families and living in community with one another. And last week, Pastor West did a phenomenal job walking us through chapter 1 of Nehemiah. And hopefully you've been able to read along with us each day in our reading plan and you're tracking along with us in the story. But Pastor West shared how Nehemiah had this burden on his heart, this God-given burden to see his city restored, not just physically, but to see the people of God come back to their God. And this burden that Nehemiah had, it caused him to fall on his face before God and to pray over this new vision that God had given him. And as we look at chapter 2 today, we begin to see that Nehemiah didn't just pray over this plan that he had, but he begins to move from prayer to action. And I think this is really interesting because to me, what we see through the example of Nehemiah is really an example of how spiritual growth is supposed to look. Go with me on this. We see that Nehemiah, he knew God, right? And then he discovered the thing that God was calling him to, this passion, this burden that was, on his heart. And then he takes that passion to God and he prays over it and he prepares himself. And finally, it leads him to action. And I want you guys to see this for yourself as Nehemiah begins to take action. Read with me, if you guys will, in chapter 2, starting in verse 7. If you guys would just read this with me. It says this. It says, I also said to him, if it pleases the king, this is Nehemiah talking, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me the timber to make beams for the gates of the citadels by the temple, and for the city wall, and the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my request. And so I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem, but there was no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by the fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through, so I went up to the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing because I yet had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. So we see in this passage that Nehemiah, he begins to make progress towards his goal of rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem. And, he goes to the king and he asks for the provisions that he needs to begin the project. And he goes out with a few other men and he begins to inspect the wall. And he checks out, how bad the damage is. And he's assessing what it's going to take and what's going on and what really needs to be done in order for this project to be successful. Essentially, what Nehemiah does is he takes action. And anytime God places a burden on your heart, it will compel you to action. Compassion leads us to take action. And action is what completes this cycle of spiritual growth in our lives. And I want you guys to think for a minute about this concept. Imagine with me for a second that you're watching a baby. Maybe it's your own, or maybe, a sibling or whatever. You're watching this baby as this baby grows up. And Pastor Wes and Missy, they're about to have their third baby, which is super exciting. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you congratulate them on their baby. But just go with me on this thought for a second. As a baby gets older, they start to grow, right? And the growth is an indicator that the baby is healthy. Like, you get the chance to see this baby grow day by day and month after month. And initially, the baby can't do anything but eat, sleep, and go potty on themselves, right? But eventually this baby begins to grow and walk. And over time, this baby can run and they can start to do things for themselves. And what's crazy is that you never really see the growth happening in the moment, right? It's very subtle. It's like one day you look up and the baby's 3 inches taller and you're like, whoa, when did that happen, right? Or maybe you've experienced this yourself and you wake up one day and you want to go put on your favorite shirt and you're like, man, the sleeves are too short. When did that happen? When did I grow? And you don't see it, but over time, it happens. Our spiritual lives are really the same way. We often are growing spiritually, but we don't really notice it in the moment. In fact, a lot of times we might think that the spiritual challenges that we're facing are actually just setbacks. But what we don't realize is that God is actually growing us. And what I love so much about the book of Nehemiah as it relates to this series, Rebuild, is that we see some really good building blocks for how we're to grow spiritually in our walk with the Lord. And Nehemiah is really practical in his approach to God. But what would happen if, that baby wasn't growing, that baby that we were talking about a minute ago? What would happen if it wasn't growing? You would immediately be concerned, right? You would be worried that something isn't right, that something would be off, and you might discover that there's some sort of developmental issue, and you would do whatever you could to address those developmental challenges physically. Well, spiritually, as we look to rebuild our spiritual lives through this series, some of you may notice that spiritually you've stopped growing. Or maybe you've just become stuck, or something needs to change. And I said it earlier, but I believe Nehemiah shows us the pattern for spiritual growth. Again, it starts with getting to know God and committing your life to Him. And then from there, we begin to learn the plans and the purposes that He has for our lives. The next step is to begin to commit to prayer and preparation as we continue to grow spiritually. And then the final step is to begin to take action. And what I find so often for so many young people who have committed their life to Christ is that they're really good at the first 3 steps, of getting to know God and, discerning His plans for their life and discovering what He has for them, and, prayer and worship and preparation. But they're not always so great at acting out their faith in God. They're not always so great at putting their faith into action. And let me give you an example from my own life. I remember graduating from college and, getting ready to go into ministry for the first time. And I was, really excited about that, or the idea of that. But I remember feeling really stuck in the moment. Like I said, I wanted to do the work of God and that I wanted to take action and begin serving the church, but physically I was doing nothing. And I remember at the time there were 2 churches that were both interviewing me to come on staff and serve as their youth pastor. And what ended up happening was I couldn't make a decision because I felt so worried about just making the wrong decision. So rather than just doing something, I was doing absolutely nothing. But here's the thing. During that time, I spent a lot of time with God. I was praying, I was reading my Bible, I was worshiping Him, I was prepared, but I wasn't growing because I wasn't actually doing anything. Spiritually speaking, I was experiencing some developmental challenges. And it wasn't until I finally talked with a friend of mine and I was, telling him about these 2 options that were in front of me, and I was trying to ask his opinion about which one he thought I should choose. And he listened for a while, but then he just kind of stopped, and he stopped me and he looked at me and he was like, "Jay, you're so worried about what job to choose. Why don't you just pick one and then ask God to go with you in it? Ask God to bless whatever decision you make." And honestly, I don't know if that's the best spiritual advice or not, but it worked for me in that moment. And I really felt like that freed me up to finally take action and to move forward. Because here's the thing, regardless of what decision I had made, what God was really wanting for me was to grow spiritually in Him. And until I took the steps of acting upon my faith, I was never going to spiritually grow in the areas that he wanted me to. And I'm sure if I had chosen a different job than the one I chose, then I probably would have learned some different things through that journey, but I still would have learned and grown through those actions. And there's some of you who are watching this who are in similar situations. You find yourself in a holding pattern, trying to make a decision about what to do next, and instead, you're just doing nothing. For you seniors, college is approaching, and maybe it has you a little nervous, and you've got these choices in front of you and these decisions to make about where you're gonna go to school and maybe what you're gonna study, and you're so worried about making the wrong decision. And I would just encourage you to ask God to go with you and just move forward, knowing that there's some incredible spiritual and intellectual growth that's gonna take place along the journey. And if there's anything that we can learn from the book of Nehemiah in these first couple chapters that we've looked at, it's about how to see a vision for your life and to begin to take action to see that vision come to fruition. And listen, I know that it can be really scary. Like, just try to imagine what it must have felt like for Nehemiah in this situation. Last week, Pastor West mentioned that Nehemiah worked for the king, right? He had, a really nice job and, a great life and pretty much anything that he ever could have wanted. And so to take this step of faith, to leave the palace and to go fight for something that many people didn't believe was worth fighting for, had to be pretty scary. I remember a few years back, I was at a friend's wedding, and he got groomsmen's gifts for everybody, and the groomsmen's gifts that he got for us was these replica swords. He got all of his groomsmen these different types of swords that represented what he thought of each of us. And I remember just recently being in my garage, and I stumbled upon this sword in the garage the other day, and for me, he gave me this like replica Spartan sword. I mean, this thing is like really heavy, and it looks awesome. And he begins telling me how much of an encouragement I've been to him in the past because of how bold he thought I was to just go for it in life and to act upon what I felt like God was calling me to do. And really, to me, that was a testimony because I knew that I wasn't always so bold on the inside. In fact, there were many times that I was scared to death to step into what God was calling me to do. And some of you guys, you may feel the same way. And what we subtly see through these first couple chapters of Nehemiah is that he had an incredible boldness to step out and to do something that not everybody approved of. Not everybody was a fan of the fact that Nehemiah wanted to help rebuild this temple. And that's something that we're going to look at in a few weeks in this series. But Nehemiah had this boldness to do what God had called him to do. And he let his compassion for the people of Israel move him towards action. One last story I'll share with you guys today is this. There's a man who was stuck on his rooftop in a flood, and he was praying for God's help. And soon a man in a rowboat came by, and the guy shouted to the man on the roof. He said, "Hey, jump in, I can save you." And the stranded man shouted back, "No, it's okay. I'm praying to God, and he's gonna save me." And so the rowboat, went on by, and then, a motorboat came by. And the fellow in the motorboat, he shouted up, he's like, "Hey, jump in, I can save you." And to this, the stranded man said, "No, thanks. I'm praying to God and he's going to save me. I have faith." And so the motorboat, just went on by and kept going. And then a helicopter came by and the pilot shouted down, "Hey, grab this rope. I'll lift you up to safety." And to this, the stranded man again replied, "No, thanks. I'm praying to God and he's going to save me. I have faith." And so the helicopter reluctantly flew away, and soon the water rose above the rooftop and the man drowned, right? And he went to heaven. And he finally got his chance to discuss this whole situation with God, and at which point he exclaimed, "I had faith in you, but you didn't save me. Like, you let me down. I don't understand why." And to this, God replied, "Dude, I sent you a rowboat, a motorboat, and a helicopter. What more do you expect?" And so that's, sort of a silly joke, but the moral of the story is this, is we can have all the faith in the world, and we can pray all the prayers, but until we take action, we're missing out on a really critical part of our own spiritual growth. And I believe what God's purpose for your life is right now is to see you grow spiritually in Him. And Nehemiah, through these first few chapters that we've read together, he gives us a blueprint for how we can grow our faith. And it starts with getting to know God, discovering the plans and the purposes that He has for your life, spending time with Him in prayer and preparation, but it ends in taking action. And can we begin to rebuild our spiritual lives today by taking action on those things that God has called us to do? What action do you need to take today to grow spiritually in your faith in God? Let me pray for you guys. Lord, we just thank you so much for everything that you've done today, and God, what you're doing in our lives, God, how you are using the story of Nehemiah to help us rebuild our own spiritual lives as you did so for them in that day. And so, God, I just pray that whatever it is that you're calling us to, whatever action step that you're calling us to take, I pray that you would give us the faith and the boldness to do just that, to take that step of faith and to do those things that you're calling us to do. God, we love you, we appreciate you, and we just ask that you would go before us in everything that we do, everything that we say. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.